Okay, so this is Westdoc Online. We are live. It's 9:30 a.m. on the West Coast. It's 12:30 in New York. It's now 4:30 in the United Kingdom. It used to be 5:30, but when we went to daylight savings time, we picked up an hour. And we have a wonderful show this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are, or if you're watching this after the fact on our website, www.westdoconline.com. It's about money. How do you get money for films? Show me the money. It's interesting. I had kind of an epiphany about the kind of filmmakers there are a year or two ago. And I'm the kind of filmmaker where you go to a network and you say, hey, I've got this project and it's about such and such, and it's going to cost you this much money, and it's going to take 6 months to make, and it's going to be an hour, or it's going to be 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever it is. And the network says, gee, that's a great idea. We like that. Okay, can you do it for this? Something less than what you propose. And they say, sure. And they say, okay, good, go. And they we'll pay you a third, or a fourth, or something along those lines. 90% of the shows that I've done the money comes from one source, and it's usually one person you're pitching to, and then their boss has to approve it if it's some amount of money. But when you're doing shows for American Masters, American Experience, Independent Lens, POV, I think you have to be another kind of filmmaker, and that's the kind that can write grants. And so today is all about grant writing, and we have a wonderful panel, and which I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But before I do that, I just want to tell you about the sponsors that make this show possible, and that's Pond 5 and LumaForge. And Pond 5 is the largest supplier of stock footage. It's some of it is crowdsourced, which is great. It's curated crowdsourced, so it's not just anybody uploading, but it's professional filmmakers uploading. But they have a tremendous library that you can look at and access online. You can see anything, and you can download it and put it in your cut. They'll have watermarks, and then you just sign up afterwards, and you can pay their very reasonable prices after the fact. And not only do they have stock footage, but they have After Effects, and they have music and sound effects, and it's a tremendous source. As a matter of fact, if you look at our website, that opening collage montage is all from Pond 5, which I haven't said before, but it is. And LumaForge is the filmmakers who are making hard drives now especially for nonlinear editors. I happen to like Final Cut Pro, and I've seen their tests where they can run 10 or 15 layers of 4K footage in Final Cut off of a regular iMac. So if you need hard drive space, which if you're filmmaking you probably do, I would go to lumaforge.com and then call Patrick or call Sam over there and talk to them about the jellyfish. Okay, let's get to our guests here. Since Jonathan is about to sneeze. This is three out of four of our guests. One of them is stuck in the rain in San Francisco. Let's start here with Maury Warshawski in the upper left-hand corner. You're in Napa Valley, I think, at your home office right now. And
that's right, Napa, California.
Maury is a writer, and he, when you say he wrote the book on this subject, it's not just a saying. He literally wrote the book, Shaking the Money Tree and How to Get Grants and Donations for Film and Video, which is exactly what we want to talk about. And he has another new book called The Fundraising House Party, which sounds like a lot of fun. I can imagine. Let's invite people over to your house and bring your checkbooks with you. Jonathan Skurnick is in the upper right-hand corner. Jonathan is an old friend of mine and a longtime creative filmmaker. Also is currently the president of New Day Films, which is an educational distributor. And Jonathan, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say you probably specialize more in making films for PBS type shows. Is that right? Jonathan?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And in the lower left-hand corner, we have Tony Bell, who's with the IDA, the International Documentary Association. And Tony is a specialist in fiscal sponsorship department and helping filmmakers. And it's funny, this morning, and I was telling Tony this, and we have Monica. Let's just switch over here to this right now, because I just see Monica just arrived here. Hold on, here we go. Boom. Monica, can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, good, and we can hear you too.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's all right. You just got here in time. Monica Navarro is with ITVS, the International Television Service, and we're really just getting started, so you haven't missed anything. I was saying there are two kinds of filmmakers: the kind that go to Discovery and A&E and Lifetime and HBO and Showtime and say, I have a film, and they say, okay, and here's a check, and go for it. And then there's the other kind that have to write grants. And I'm not sure, which is easier or which is more difficult, but I'm of the former instead of the latter. And why don't we start with Tony, who is with the IDA in downtown Los Angeles, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how the process works on getting grants and what exactly you do.
Well, I work in our fiscal sponsorship department, and for those who don't know what fiscal sponsorship is, it essentially gives filmmakers the opportunity to be under our 501c3 umbrella, so their donors through the film can get the benefit of the tax write-off. Fiscal sponsorship also opens up the field for certain government grants, because there are certain grantors out there who will only contribute to a filmmaker if they have a fiscal sponsor. So essentially what we do is we act as a re-granting organization. The money comes to us, and then when the filmmaker needs it, they can request it. That's a simple thing. As far as applying for grants, our organization partnered with the Sundance Institute last year and released what's called the core application. And essentially, the reason why the core application was created was because grantors across the board had different ways of asking the same question. And unfortunately, grant writing does take up a lot of time for filmmakers. And when I talk to filmmakers, I'll find that they're either in the creative stage of making the film, or they're in the stage of trying to raise money for the film. So what the core application did was set a set number of questions that are the same for grantors who come on board. And I think we have about 20 on board right now, as well as 5 additional fiscal sponsors. So there are certain questions that are the same for every application. And then if there are additional materials that a particular grantor wants, those are considered supplementary materials. So the core of the application is the same, and then we as a grantor can ask for additional materials. For example, for the fiscal sponsorship application, one of the supplemental materials we ask for is a copy of the project director's resume. We also ask for a past work sample, which is optional, and then we ask for a current work sample, which is optional. For the Enterprise Documentary Fund, there are additional questions that are focused on how the film relates to journalism, how it incorporates journalistic ethics. So because those different funds have different questions, but the main thing is the core application really does, we've gotten a lot of great feedback from filmmakers, because the core application has really cut down on the grant writing time that people had to spend raising money.
So are you saying that you write it once, and the core
Correct.
application sends it to?
No, well, unfortunately it's not a portal in and of itself.
No, but
Questions for the core questions are the same. So everybody asks for a log line, everybody asks for a narrative, everybody asks for a fundraising and distribution section. So there's certain things that are asked for, and the filmmaker has to submit those to each individual grantor.
What's the timing from your point of view, Tony? Somebody says, I have this project and I'm writing the grant, and it's January 1st. what would you say as a generalization? That when can that filmmaker expect to see some money coming in the door if they're successful? I mean, is that a fair question?
Well, it's a fair question. Different grantors have different timelines. I think on average, I would say it can range from anywhere to 4 to 6 months. For example, the grant for the National Endowment for Humanities, the application for they have 2 application rounds. So the people who submitted during the August application round won't find out until April 1st that they received the grant. And the NEH has the longest time period. But some people who are invited to apply, because that does happen, particularly with some more well-established filmmakers, sometimes the money can come as quickly as 2 to 3 weeks. So
that's what I want. I would like an invitation. Jonathan,
it's great to have an invitation.
What is your experience with grant writing? How do you deal with grant writing?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I want to actually switch and do it your way, Chuck. I want to go to Showtime and ask for money and get it and make a film and finish in less than 6 months. That sounds much more fun than what I do, but I haven't tried doing that yet. But so my approach is similar to what Tony's saying. I have a project that more often than not is a social issue subject that has really compelling characters and a really interesting story. And then I identify funders who would be interested in funding that story. And if they do take the core application, I'll do that. And if not, a lot of funders still haven't joined the core application, especially funders who are not specifically funding film. And you just create a spreadsheet and you figure out all the different funders who could potentially fund your project. And then you figure out all the deadlines and you prioritize by the deadlines and you start applying. And meanwhile, you're also in production and you're shooting your film and continuing to move that forward. So that's sort of the typical kinds of things. Although I have to say sometimes a project, it doesn't seem fundable at one particular time for maybe the story or the subject is still too controversial or whatever. That's the case with my series of films about trans youth. I tried to get funding for many years, and except for 1 or 2 visionary funders, was not successful. And then as the public understanding and acceptance of trans people increased, all of a sudden funders wanted to come on board. So also there's can be a timing issue. Assuming the film is fundable, sometimes you don't get funding until like society's caught up with what you're trying to do.
So I've asked for a little clip from some of you, and let's just see an example of what Jonathan is talking about here.
Some people think, oh, boys should only do this, and girls should only do that, or girls should think this, and boys should think that. It's not true.
And I told my dad I want some purple skinny jeans. He was like, are you crazy?
My closet was literally pink, and now it's almost all blues, blacks, and browns.
But remember that gender is not binary, right?
There's a spectrum.
We'd been discussing a lot of the gender issues in class, and to be honest, I didn't know what to expect.
Some of them seem to be really thinking about it.
I think it had never occurred to him that you could look at the world this way, that you could take off these labels.
Turns out that they couldn't stop talking.
I like to wear sneakers, jeans, and I don't like dolls. I hate the color pink.
It doesn't matter what gender you are, it matters what kind of person you are.
It says here that she is too weak to stand up for herself. Are you too weak to stand up for yourself?
No.
No.
If I give you a marker, I want you to look at that color of marker and think to yourself, is this a boy color?
Yes.
Or is this a girl color? Or could this be...
So where was that? That was a 2-minute clip you gave me, and I only ran about a minute of it. But where did that appear? Is that a trailer for a longer film, or what was that for? Whoops! Wait a second, Jonathan. Sorry, got your. Why?
Oh, that was my fault. Yeah, I was
good.
on mute. So that's a trailer for a clip for and a trailer for a film called "Creating Gender Inclusive Schools," and the film itself is 21 minutes long. And we filmed it at a school that decided they wanted to train everyone in the community, teachers, parents, and students, on how to be more thoughtful and inclusive for trans and gender expansive youth, and integrate all those ideas into the actual curriculum on an appropriate grade level for each grade.
You know, from a filmmaker's point of view, it certainly looked very professional and well done and all that, but I'm just afterwards thinking about, what about releases? Did you have to get releases from all the parents for every kid that's on camera?
Yeah, we worked with the school to get releases from every single member of the community. We have a stack about this high of releases.
Where was that? Was that in the LA area?
That was in Oakland, California.
It certainly is different than when I went to school.
Yes.
Let's go to Maury for a moment and talk a little bit about, how did you get into working in the nonprofits, and how do you help nonprofit filmmakers, and is there a secret here, secret sauce in getting some of this money, or what's the story here, Maury?
You've asked me too many questions. How I got in is a crazy story. There's no secret sauce. I think I want to riff a little bit off of what Jonathan said about the fact that some films are not fundable. I know, Chuck, earlier you said there are two kind of filmmakers. There's your kind, and then there's a filmmaker who goes out for grants. But in my experience, the other kind of filmmaker is really lucky if they can get grants, because a lot of films are not grantable. So a lot of the filmmakers that I work with are hoping they can get grants, but they're not relying on getting grants totally. They're also exploring the full spectrum of fundraising opportunities, which is heavily now going to individuals for support, and maybe getting some corporate donations and doing house parties, that whole range of activity. It's really hard to get a grant. That scene is highly competitive. So I'm sure there's a lot of things we could say about how to do that particular hustle, but in my experience, most filmmakers who have to find money are spending anywhere from 3 to 6 years making their films, and 80% of that time is looking for money.
Well, you're sort of hurting sales of your book. You know, people are going to go rush to Amazon to get your book, and now not so sure, maybe, huh?
Well, my book is actually highly positive about how to find that money, and only a portion of the book is about grants, because I think you need a really holistic and wide-ranging purview of how to find the dollars. And in fact, the first 2 chapters of my book are not about looking for money at all. They're a lot about looking within and finding out who you are and raise your level of self-awareness so that you're ready to ask for money in lots of different environments. And a lot of the book also is how to prepare your knowledge of your project so that you can be lucid and passionate about it in many environments and lure people into giving you and your project support.
So what am I missing here? I'm a little taken aback. I was kind of expecting you to say, well, rush out, get my book, and in chapter 3 it'll tell you how to get 100,000, and chapter 4 I don't know.
The first thing I do in my book is try and talk you out of doing it at all. In fact, when my daughter decided she was going to do her first documentary, I said, don't do it. I begged her not to do it. And then she spent 6 years working on it, and most of that was looking for money. And I was helping her, and I'm supposed to be an expert in the field.
I'm glad you reminded me. Let's take a quick look at your daughter's documentary for a moment, called Big Sonia, which actually I had seen as part of the Academy, but let's take a look.
You live with it all your life, and you can never forget. I would catch myself laughing. I felt guilty.
When they found us, they came with German shepherds, and those dogs sniffed us out.
So I keep myself always busy, and helps me not to think so much about it, what I went through. Hi, how are you? Okay.
32.
Got it. Okay, Fred.
To survive, especially at this mall, all these years, is a miracle in itself, because everything upstairs is closed.
Let Mama see. That's perfect.
Teenagers are really hard to reach now.
If I reach one harm, I accomplish something.
Okay. She made me want to change things, the way things are. She made me want to make an impact on the world.
The shop closing concerns me because she has such a drive to go every day.
It takes people who've been through something to reach people who are going through something. I just want to thank you.
It's okay.
So that film is actually a charming film. I think, in a way, what it had going against it is that it was a Holocaust film in terms of the Academy, because there've been, it was a sort of a running gag, too many Holocaust films in the past for awards. It was quite a good film. And so did you help your daughter and her husband in terms of raising money, or did they just read your book and get, what was the story?
I'm laughing because when my current son-in-law had his first date with my daughter Leah, they're both filmmakers, and in his apartment he had put out a copy of my book just to prove to her that he was interested in independent filmmaking, and he had never made the connection that she was my daughter. So she walks into his apartment and says, "Oh, that's very funny. You got my dad's book on your table there." And he was totally unaware that I'd written the book. But at any rate, what was the question? You got me sidetracked.
Well, what did they take advantage of your knowledge, and did they raise a lot of money through grants?
Well, they should have, but it turns out that there were very, very few grantors who were interested in giving her support, so we had to use other routes. And my theory from the beginning was that most of this money was going to come from Kansas City. And I ended up being right. And we found two really great funders.
Kansas is where the film is shot and takes place in that mall.
And that's where my mother lives. And I knew that they were going to go crazy over it. So we got individuals who coughed up big bucks and two foundations. One foundation I found by accident, which was run by the father of a woman who went to high school with me. And we were able to have a personal meeting with them, and they gave 2 large grants. But most of the rest of the money came from individuals. A big Kickstarter campaign and meeting one-on-one with people and talking them into giving support. And also Lee and Todd live in Seattle, and they've got strong connections there, so there was good corporate support from Seattle. But it was the full range of support. And grants ended up being only a small portion.
Well, one of the places that I used to think of as free money was ITVS. And I say free money because my understanding of the deal at ITVS is that they give you money and they want the rights to run the show on PBS for a certain amount of time, and then you control the film and you own the film, which is pretty amazing. And Monica, maybe you can tell us a little about what the deal is with ITVS, please.
Yes, it isn't that simple. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think though, before I break down ITVS, and there will be a connection because ITVS funded my first film. I think I'm thinking of people who are maybe watching this webinar and thinking, okay, if I'm not commissioned to do work, if I'm not Maury Wachowski's daughter, how am I going to get funding for my film? I think we think a lot about who has access to tell stories, and I think there is a lot of opportunities. And what I remember reading your book 10 years ago when I was fundraising Maury was just thinking creatively about who your network is and who your resources are. But I think we have to be honest, not everyone has networks that include people who will, give big donations, but you certainly have resources you don't realize. I mean, when I was a first-time filmmaker, I got my first grant from my city's Humanities Council. It doesn't exist anymore, but a lot of states and a lot of cities still do have arts and humanities councils that I think are good for seed funding that are kind of generally for artists. And I did the old school version of Kickstarter, which was writing letters to people. But I think that's leaning on your community that believes in you, maybe more than the film, but believes in you as an artist and wants to support your work. So I do think it's important to, which I always appreciated about Maury's philosophy, was sort of thinking who your resources are. I think also grants are organizations that want to support artists and good work. So I think it also requires doing your research. I guess I feel like it's a little negative saying that it's so competitive. It is competitive, but I think filmmakers need to do their homework and think about, how does my film fit the mission of this grant? Or how will my work help contribute to a dialogue that fits within the mission of this organization? And I think that's why I was unusual in getting funded as a first-time filmmaker, my first time applying to ITVS. But I knew my story, I knew the value of my story, and I had leveraged support despite the fact that I didn't come from money. I didn't have access to a lot of investors, but I did get a small humanities grant that validated my project and then helped me leverage the support of my community, because I got this grant from my city. And then I got artist residencies and mentorship, and everything kind of helped me scale up to the point where then I was able to get grants, and then I was able to get co-production funding with ITVS. So I guess what's kind of distinct about ITVS, it's not free money. Nothing's free, I don't think, but you do have an enormous amount of freedom, and you do have editorial control and maintain copyright of your project. It's a co-production, unless you get development funding with us, and that's a little bit different because we're entering into a development deal with you, which is inherently risky. So there's no option for production unless you apply to us later, whether through our open funding or through commissioned funding, go into production. But we are your co-producer in every sense of the word. We're probably investing the most significant portion of the budget, and we want to be active collaborators in the realization of the film, whatever stage we come at, even if it's coming at rough cut, it's not a cut down fee. We're working with you closely to collaborate on what is going to be the version that goes to broadcast. So there's development funding that's open. There's some commissioning funding, but the majority of our development funding is through the Diversity Development Fund, which I co-manage for filmmakers of color. We also have development funding to do a short or a pilot through our digital open call for short form content that is meant to be standalone or episodic. And we're trying to engage younger creators and viewers there through our new YouTube channel. And then our big fund open call, which I also co-manage, is co-production funding, and we're licensing your US broadcast rights and limited streaming rights. So you have all other versions and rights available to you, but we're interested in helping you develop what's going to be the version of the film that's going to go to the widest possible audience, which is public television.
Can you, let me just interrupt. I'm getting some messages, I think, through my website. And yes, you can communicate. I can try. We've been unsuccessful to getting these messages in the past, but I'm seeing a couple messages come through now from people. And I think it's through that little tag on the website, westdoconline.com. So if you have a question, please put it through. So I have a question. And as it's pouring here now in LA, really pouring, my question is, it's a two-part question. Am I, as not a person of color and not a first-time filmmaker and not a rookie, am I at a disadvantage if I'm applying to ITVS?
No, absolutely not. I think our Diversity Development Fund was launched 14 years ago to address a real issue both in our pipeline and across the industry. I mean, we are working to create access and resources and opportunities for people who've been systematically left out. And doing that starts with the seed funding to then nurture these filmmakers and stories to go into our pipeline for production and then bring it to PBS and our other public media partners. But we want filmmakers at all stages of career. We have relationships with filmmakers over many years. We just funded, actually this past year, we funded 2 filmmakers who were funded our very first year of funding. So they're quite veteran. They got the first, co-production monies from us 25 years ago. So we look at ourselves as cultivating and elevating the independent film community at all stages. And I think we're inclusive, but we also have to address, we're not just that we have to address, we do have to address, and we're leaders in what it means to support independent voices. And part of our mandate by Congress is to include underrepresented communities. So we're really proud that in our demographics in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of orientation are quite strong, but we're always trying to do better and push and lead the rest of the industry. But I don't think if you're a veteran filmmaker, if you're a white male, you're not going to be welcomed at ITVS. I think you can look at our catalog and that speaks for itself. I think we're pretty inclusive and we're cultivating relationships across the board.
Which reminds me, I actually have a clip from ITVS, which, if I can find it here. I'm going to run the clip. It's a couple of minutes. Let's see how this goes.
I met a boy who has never used electricity.
I met a migrant who dreams of going to college.
I met a nobody who became a rock god.
I met a woman interrupting gang violence.
I met the world's greatest sushi chef.
I met a reporter who plagiarized his stories.
I met an artist who refused to be pushed around.
I met a bank robber looking for forgiveness.
I met a boy on the spectrum looking for love.
I met a president fighting for his country's survival.
I met a woman who has been trafficked.
I met a trafficker.
I met a bishop, and then I met his husband.
I met a new kind of brother.
I met a boy who was bullied every day.
I met a soldier who was raped by her superior.
I met a man who survived a plague.
I met an Olympian who fought for her dream.
I met a fighter who refused to go to war.
I met a filmmaker who learned to live again.
I met the new face of ballet.
I met a boy.
I met a person.
I met a person. I met a person. I met a person. I met a voice. I met a voice.
Introducing you to real people who take a stand to change the world. Get to know IT.
Well, that certainly had some highlights of a bunch of films that I have seen before on PBS or Academy, submissions. I have a question here from John Giannini that came in online. I think it's a really good question, and maybe none of you know the answer, or maybe you do. And the question is, how will... I'm glad that's not my phone. Because my phone's already wrong. And this question is for any of you. If you know the answer, you think you know the answer, how will the new tax law affect either grants or if somebody wants to contribute money to you, wants to give you money as a, I don't know, as a profit, for-profit, non-profit? Any of you have any idea? So I've heard somewhere that the new tax law is actually much more favorable now. And again, I'm not an accountant and I don't know for sure, but somebody told me that now it's, if you give somebody, say you're a wealthy person, you say, Jonathan, here's $100,000. I want you to go out and make a film about such and such, that wealthy person can write off the full $100,000 right away. Anybody know?
I can speak
I would
to
recommend
that.
you talk to an accountant or Tony.
Yes. But because we've gotten that question a lot from not only filmmakers, but also individuals who are donating. And essentially, the charitable deduction is still available. However, how much you can write off in taxes really depends on what tax bracket you're in and whether you're itemized or not. So, as Monica said, it's best to go to your accountant. But the deduction is still there. It just depends on where you are on the scale. What
kind of money can a filmmaker expect from ITVS, or what is the range of money from?
Yeah, for development, both for the Digital Open Call and Diversity Development Fund it's up to $25,000 to develop your broadcast documentary or long form, or to develop a digital short or or a pilot for an episodic series. For the open call, it's up to $350,000 of co-production. We would like it pushing funding, but we've also, if there's sometimes a gap, and so it's leveraged against, but you've got to close that gap, and we'll work with you to have a realistic budget that's going to help you deliver. Through our commissioned is less. It's generally around $200,000.
So what happens if
go through open call?
What happens if somebody has I'm making these numbers up, but if they have a $400,000 budget for a project, and so you say, okay, we'll give you $200,000, is that contingent on them getting the other $200,000, or what? How does that work for ITVS?
Well, I'm going to say you're going to be asking for up to $350,000, because the $200,000 is just for commissioned. So that's you have to already have a distributor in place. So that's generally maybe like we're doing a co-production with Frontline or American Masters. So you've got some money in from them, and then we're all sort of pooling our resources and developing the film. So let's say you're applying to open call and you have a $400,000 budget. Is that that was your average, $400,000?
Well, I'm just making the number.
We'd like to see that let's say 400. We'd like to see that you've raised some money, and that you have a fundraising plan, and that you have some pending funds that you've maybe identified and applied to other grants, or have a strategy for raising the money. So I would say that it would raise a flag to me, and I'm reviewing open call applications right now. If you have no money in, you have no fundraising strategy, and you're asking us for $350,000, I would be a little bit concerned that you don't have a realistic plan of how to finance the film. There are exceptions, but it's based on, that person's track record and ability to produce. Like we funded Bernardo Ruiz's recent film, and it was pretty early in production, but it was time sensitive and critical that he got out in the field. We've funded a number of his films before. He did have some producer cash in, and I think had gotten a small amount of money, but it was really, urgent that we support him to get this story. And again, he's delivered several films to us, so we felt confident that he was a good risk. But your producer cash is your investment. So I'd also tell people to keep good track of any money you're spending on the film, because all of that is your investment that you get to recoup later.
I have another question. This is from Aaron. It came in online, and I think he mistyped here. He says, does ITV, I hope he meant, does ITVS pick up narrative shorts that are finished?
No. We were last year for Digital Open Call open to narrative shorts, but they changed that this year. Just leave more documentary or animation. So Future States was the last initiative we had that was narrative shorts. I would encourage him to look at our website and see what we've funded and learn a little bit more about the films, but the only narrative films beyond, of course, Masterpiece, if he's making a British narrative film, I'm sure he'll have a great chance pitching it to PBS. But film school shorts through KQED in San Francisco shows recent narrative shorts by film school grads. And there's some other local stations and initiatives that do narrative. I know World Channel just had a request for proposals through CPB and now LEAP, and it was shorts for the American Graduate Initiative, and they awarded monies to both documentary and narrative stories. But I think they have to look for what the opportunities are for narrative. But right now, ITVS isn't funding narrative.
So I'd like to point out to filmmakers who are watching this, if they don't already know, I think IDA, International Documentary Association, recently put up a database of grantors, fundors, potential grantors. It's a phenomenal database. So if you go to documentary.org and then you go to funding tab and you go down to the bottom and you'll see this database, which has how many, Tony?
It's under other grants.
Yeah, and there's probably 100 potential grantors, including ITVS and organizations that you never heard of that have a bucket full of money, and they're waiting for you to call them, right, and come by and pick it up. So let me just go to Maury again for a moment. What if I have a partial commitment from, let's say, a PBS show, which actually has happened to me on a couple of subjects. Can I call you up and say, hey, where do I get the other $300,000 to make this show? And do you work as a consultant too? And obviously it says you do, but I mean, for filmmakers, or how does that work, Maury?
Well, I'd probably call Tony first. But I don't actually write grants for anyone anymore. I'm a little more interested in getting the filmmaker centered in understanding themselves and their project really well so that they can go out and find money. And then I help them create a fundraising strategy. I don't actually ask for money or look for money for anyone anymore. So I'm usually involved heavily at the beginning end of the fundraising process, and I'll hold the filmmaker's hands through the process. I'll look at their materials. I'll help them put together a strategy that I think is going to work. And it should be an all-encompassing strategy that looks at every avenue of possible funding. And a lot of that is dependent on two big things. One is the project, the nature of the project, which may or may not be a magnet for grantors. And also the filmmaker themselves, because some filmmakers are better at doing certain kinds of fundraising hustles. And then we put those two together, given the universe where we think money is available, and then we put together a strategy to attack it.
Jonathan, what are you working on? Have you applied for grants recently, or what are you doing that we should know about?
Yeah, throughout my career, I've applied for many, many grants. I think I've received probably over 30 foundation grants in my career so far, including ITVS and MacArthur and some of the other big ones, but also a lot of smaller ones like family foundations who are interested in the topic and maybe haven't funded film or haven't funded film a lot in the past. I really like what both Monica and Maury were talking about, sort of looking at funding a film as like a pie chart. And, some percentage is going to be from individuals, some will be from foundations, some, if you're very lucky, from corporate, some from the PBS world, either from ITVS or one of the minority consortia, and so on and so forth. So really thinking creatively and outside the box of where you can put the pieces of your pie together to fund the full amount of your film. But yes, recently I got grants from about 12 different funders in the last 2 years. And again, some of the grants were from very typical types of funders, and then some funders were very specific to the topic. And some funders were, I just found because they're like Maury's story, it was like a friend of a friend who had this foundation that I would never have known about otherwise. So yeah, it's a whole different group of funders that I've gone to. And for my next film, for the first time, I'm going to be tackling the National Endowment for the Humanities application process, and I'm feeling a little intimidated by that, but I'm fortunate in the fact that since it's government funding, they're required to communicate with American citizens or American people living in the U.S. who want to get funds. So I actually have had a nice, lovely, long conversation with one of their program officers and got some coaching from her and some ideas on how to approach them, and that was extremely helpful. And she's also just very enthusiastic about the project. So, I'm feeling moderately hopeful about that. We'll see what happens.
It just occurred to me that the new administration, I don't want to get back to the tax thing, it's not about tax, but the new administration has said that they're cutting out, what did I just read, where they're cutting out grants and, the support for the arts in general. How is this affecting ITVS and grants. I mean, we know he's not a big supporter of the arts. So is it affecting us at this time or not yet?
I can't speak to the NEA and NEH, and I think that's what the recent article you're mentioning was about. In terms of ITVS, I think in these moments, similar when journalism was coming under fire, and then we saw an uptick in people actually subscribing to journalism outlets and renewing subscriptions, I'm hoping it motivates people to think about if arts and culture is important, and then especially something like public television and public media and public radio, how essential that is to a democracy. I'm hoping it spurs in the other direction, because an executive action can't end ITVS or public media. Public media was formed by Congress. ITVS was mandated by Congress after lobbying from independent producers. So it would take a congressional act to defund us. Our president, Sally Jo Pfeiffer, works very hard on our behalf. And we actually have a lot of support from Congress throughout the country, especially in rural and middle America. I mean, Oklahoma City is consistently one of our highest rated stations for Independent Lens, our series. And, the public broadcasting system is the emergency broadcasting system for rural places in the US. So actually, our representatives throughout the country know how critical public media is for their state. So we have good support, but I do think it's important for just Americans to think about what values they hold. And I think it's critical that we have public media. So I hope that it forces people, just like they've maybe renewed their subscription to their local paper or a national paper that's doing good reporting. I mean, I think you should support public radio, public media, if it's something that you feel is value to having, like a free independent press, and support the arts. But we are forward funded, so we're not going anywhere. We got a banner year of applications in January 2017, and I think it was due for a few reasons that MacArthur wasn't funding individual filmmakers anymore. They've shifted their support to organizations. But I also think folks were maybe afraid that we weren't going to be funding anymore. But where we see our role as being even more important, and our mission really being the foundation of what we do, and that we're here to support filmmakers and artists that are telling the really risky stories. And so it's kind of more essential that we're here and supporting those stories. And I think, Jonathan brought up a good point, that stories that maybe were hard to fund before, I think people are taking bigger risks because they see the value of stories like this that from the ground show the challenges people are facing and the voices that we need to hear. So I actually think in this moment, if it animates people and activates them, that's actually a positive thing, because we shouldn't take for granted that we have free press and that how valuable arts is to this country. So to me, I really drink the Kool-Aid of public media. They were a great supporter of me as a first-time filmmaker, but it really formed the work I did for the next decade. I mean, I just really saw I really saw how much they nurtured me as a young filmmaker and producer, and saw how essential my story was. And I don't know that I, would have gotten that support anywhere else. Or I think of my former mentor, Joseph Tavares, said, no one else is going to give you $100,000 and say that you have editorial control, which I think is still true.
Well, that's one of the big trade-offs that I neglected to mention earlier, that when you go to Discovery Channel or A&E or any of them, and they're writing a check for the full amount, you generally lose editorial control. But it doesn't have to be, that doesn't mean it's onerous. It just means that you're going to have somebody looking over your shoulder making strong suggestions from time to time, perhaps. And I've done shows where I thought the executives from the networks were very, very helpful, because they have in many cases, a very objective eye that they can look at things that you don't see, because you know how difficult it was to get that shot, or how hard it was to get that person to come on camera. And to them, they're being more objective. And then I've worked with executives too that are onerous. Let me just switch subjects for a second. And I don't know, it's a little off subject, but it just occurred to me that maybe some of you know, why is it that there are so few local PBS stations that are producing programs. I mean, you have NET in Newark, you have GBH in Boston, and now I'm running out of stations. Even I think one of the big regrets in LA, the KCET, when it was a PBS station, did one or two big programs in 20 years. And now the other KOCE is the local station here, and they run all the PBS programs, but I don't see them producing any, and I can't for the life of me quite figure out, especially in LA, where there are so many filmmakers. Let's just say for the sake of argument, half the filmmakers are in LA area, or San Francisco in LA. Why aren't the two local stations here participating? Again, we're off subject, but does anybody have a quick, easy answer for that?
Well, I don't think that's true, although I do think filmmakers could be, I think local stations could be supporting more independent filmmakers. Some of them don't have a lot of resources, so they kind of vary. I mean, the two that you name are two of the biggest stations in the country, so they have quite, they're foundations that have a lot of support. But there's a station in Tennessee that's been doing this great program because they're one of the communities that took in a lot of refugees. So they did a series, something about neighbors, but it's examining how Tennessee is basically being transformed to be one of these refugee sites and these new Americans that are coming. KQED in San Francisco has Truly California, which is for independent films about California, as well as the film school shorts. KCT did their public media, but they're not supported by PBS, but I think they've been doing great fine art, and PBS SoCal is, I think, is doing some interesting work. But there are local stations producing. The Detroit station has done some great work and reporting on water issues there. But I do think that there could be more, and I do think filmmakers could connect more with their local stations. I had a residency at WGBH, which doesn't exist anymore, but that gave me access to mentorship from producers and an office space, and that's what led to my getting funded by ITVS, was through that residency. So, there are local stations. We do have a number of films that come through that have support from local stations if it's a story happening in their backyard. We just funded a film about the Blackfeet flood in the 60s in Montana, and Montana PBS is partnering with them. So some stations can sometimes maybe just be the presenting station, where they're the ones that are kind of bringing it to market, as it were, to the rest of the system. But that actually goes a long way because they're taking the lead and ownership, and other stations are more, interested. We do that marketing for you if it's our series, Independent Lens, or POV would do that marketing for you, or Voces through Latino Public Broadcasting. But then also sometimes they can give you maybe some in-kind post-production resources, or take care of your closed captioning, or even just, again, marketing locally. Mississippi Public Broadcasting has partnered with independent stations. So it's more, if you're filming somewhere in that state or in that area, then I think that's good incentive for you to try to develop a relationship with that station and see what opportunities there are. But GBH and NET are behemoths, and
well,
that's a different story.
that's why isn't KOCE a behemoth? It's got the second largest market in the country, and why isn't it producing
I think they do a lot
of national programming?
I can't speak to all the stations, but I did work at GBH before ITVS, and I would like to see more work with local producers, because again, the issues with our industry, once you're on the ground, you see it, just like with print and radio. There's a lot of work to do to be more inclusive in the stories. So I think for it to be sustainable, we need to bring in more independent producers, and we have we've had a number of co-productions with American Masters. I've been really excited to see how they're kind of using that legacy series and diversifying, like, what types of stories and what subjects are American Masters and who tells those stories. We've had good partnerships with Frontline, but I'd love to see that with other national series, bringing in more independent producers, because I think that we're still there's legacy issues even within public media, but
well, they're in Frontline, which is one of my favorite series of all time, and they do really great work. But I think
Yeah.
You know, I keep seeing the same names for producers there over and over and over again. But, you know, look, it's hard to complain when they're doing great shows. Let me switch subjects just for a second about fiscal sponsorship, which is a term maybe some who are watching the show don't know what it is. And Tony, do you want to explain briefly what fiscal sponsorship is and what the IDA does? But make it brief, because I have a couple more questions, and there's some questions coming in online too, please.
So essentially, what fiscal sponsorship offers a filmmaker is it enables them to be underneath our charitable 501c3 umbrella. So we take donations on behalf of the film, and the donors get the benefit of the tax write-off. And as I said before, there's certain government grants and certain larger foundations that will only give to a filmmaker if they do have a fiscal sponsor. So essentially, we act as good stewards of the funds. We don't maintain any creative control or any editorial control. We just control the money, and the filmmaker can request funds whenever they need it. And we usually do disbursements once a week. So it's a pretty simple process.
Well, when you say you don't have any editorial control, you just control the money.
We hold the money. I probably should have said it like that, but the money is under our discretion. So basically, we have in the contract, we have a responsibility to the filmmaker and to the donors. To the donors, we have the responsibility of making sure that the funds are used for the film. So
one of the questions,
with the money.
Right? One of the questions that just came in over online is, what is a fair percentage? Because you didn't discuss that. What's a fair percentage to charge? And I think this is a good issue that people who aren't familiar with this should be familiar. And it's something that I assume you work in your budget. What's a fair percentage? What do you? Yes. I know what IDA charges, but what's the range and what's fair and why are some more than others?
Range between 5% and 15%. Our fee is 7%, which is around the average fee. Those who charge, fiscal sponsors who charge a higher percentage, offer a different type of fiscal sponsorship, and they offer more services. For example, a fiscal sponsor that charges 15%, they're actually handling a lot of the day-to-day accounting, they're paying a lot of the bills, they're handling the payroll for the film. Essentially, what we do for our 7% is, again, the money is, we're essentially act as a re-granting organization, and the filmmaker requests the funds from us, and they spend the funds at the discretion on the film. And we require reporting once a year, whereas somebody who goes with the fiscal sponsor that charges a higher percentage, where they're offering more services on the day-to-day activities, sometimes the reporting can be as often as every 2 weeks or once a month.
Jonathan, what has your experience been on fiscal sponsors? You're muted.
So I've had many different fiscal sponsors. I've been happy with all of them. I've never worked with IDA, but I've worked with the Center for Independent Documentary, the Hartley Film Foundation, Human Arts Association, a couple others, and they've all been in that range that was just shared. And yeah, the ones that charge lower basically just pass your money through and don't do hardly anything else, and folks that charge a higher percentage. No, I'm just saying. Okay. Well, I've had two fiscal sponsors that charge 5%, and that's basically all they did was pass the money on to me. But other fiscal sponsors do other things and are more helpful. And right now, Center for Independent Documentaries also on the lower end, but they also provide a bunch of other services, and they help publicize your work, and so I'm very happy with them. But I've heard great things about IDA as well.
Well, IDA, if you're watching this and you're not familiar with IDA, you certainly should be. Go to documentary.org. It's a never-ending resource for information for documentary filmmakers. There is another question that came.
Just to say just a little bit more about what we do for our 7%. One of the things that we do is we assist filmmakers with the process of applying for grants. And that can how much work is involved in that depends on the grantor. Sometimes we are required to apply for the grant on behalf of the filmmaker. For example, the NEH is formulated like that. Sometimes they need certain paperwork from us as the fiscal sponsor. So our tax information, our tax returns, information on our board of directors. One thing we do handle for people who do smaller donations is we do handle all the receipting. So the filmmaker doesn't have to worry about that. So donations made through us, we send the filmmaker a notification that this particular amount of money is here, and then we send a donation receipt to the donor. And we also offer a host of other services, but that's kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Are any of the films that are being made with grants and grant money, are there agents involved too that are taking a piece?
I found, I did when we, before we got our enterprise grant, which is actually funded by the MacArthur Foundation, I was actually responsible for doing the research to find out what filmmakers who work on films that have that are geared toward journalism are wanting, like what kind of services they want, whether it be funding or help with an attorney and that type of thing. And in my informal survey, I found that there are some filmmakers who have agents. They were all men of a certain age. And they were well-established filmmakers who were able to use their agents to go to help them set up pitch meetings. And I've been in documentary film at that point for 7 years, and I've never even had heard of a filmmaker having an agent. Whereas on the other hand, women filmmakers tended to either have a spouse who had a quote unquote real job, or a significant other who had a real job, or were worked in academia, or had some other job to supplement while they were doing their filmmaking. So agents are a thing. I don't know how someone gets one, but I guess it helps to be male because those are the only ones that know who do it. But again, they are some more well-established filmmakers.
So a question just came up. We've sort of covered it, but maybe I wonder if there's an easy answer. Then the question is, earlier in the video you talked about two types of films, some that will get funded and some that won't get funded. Can you discuss briefly what kind of films are more likely to get funded? This is from Antonio.
I think it's really a matter of timing, because I went to an event at the Hammer Museum, and the producer of The Invisible War was there. And the Kirby Dig also did The Hunting Ground. And they said at the time when they were working on The Invisible War, they were beginning research on examining sexual harassment in Hollywood, but they could not get any funding for it. So they moved on to The Hunting Ground, and now since then, obviously the Weinstein story has broke, and everyone is trying to give them funding for this film they wanted to do years ago. So it's a matter of timing, what the public is interested in. Also, filmmakers really do have to hustle and really understand who their audience is. One thing that we do is we encourage filmmakers to have a really diversified fundraising strategy. So that should include grants, it should include crowdfunding, it should include individual donors, it should even include investors. So essentially they should try to go after essentially what Jonathan described as that whole pie. And part of that is we encourage people to be very detailed about who their initial audience and have different levels of audience. So there's that core audience that's specific to the film, and then there are also outliers who may be interested in the topic of some particular range, and really target those people and organizations. Not necessarily because some of the smaller organizations may have funding for films, but if they can build relationships with those organizations to do, they can actually do fundraising events, or also even tap into those donor resources that may be available.
Well, I think this has been very informative. Obviously, I think we probably could sit here for 4 hours and talk about the best way to get money for films, but none of us want to. I mean, maybe the last question is, if you were and maybe it's a brief answer, we could go around the screen here, so to speak, and we'll start with Maury. If you were starting out and you had an idea that you thought was perfect for a PBS film, what would you do about getting grants? How would you where would you apply? Or is that too broad a question, you think?
No, I think the first thing I would ask myself is, who am I making this for? So when Monica talked about audience, I always call it the ecology. I'd say to myself, if I'm successful and I reach people, who am I going to reach? Who's going to be interested in this film, this what I have to say? Because that's really the core of driving everything else. I mean, that's where you're going to find your money. That's where you're going to sell your tickets. That's where you're going to fill seats in an auditorium. That's the schools and organizations who are going to use it and buy it. I mean, so I don't use the word audience anymore. I only use the word community. And that's a whole other topic, but that's my best advice to start there.
Monica?
That's a good answer. It's hard to follow. Yeah, I do think it's, I guess to build on that, the audience, it's not just that everyone will be interested in your film, because reality is not everyone will be interested in your film, but if you really think about who the audience is, like even deeper than the community, but thinking sometimes about that person, like their age, their demographics, where they're consuming media, where they're going to find community and to experience film or watch a film. And for us, we're funding films that are going to spark conversations that either people are having or need to be having, maybe forecasting what conversations or dialogues Americans want to have, knowing that we have the biggest audience. So I would think about that. And I think, for us, if you're getting started, I actually like proposal writing because I feel like it takes you out of that space of the story and makes you drill down, like, okay, here is my story, and here's how, the treatment is how you're communicating your vision, your structure, your character, giving sort of a tangible sense on paper, which is weird because it's going to be an audio-visual thing, but as much as you can give people the feeling of how you're going to tell that story. And then I like that the needs, you have to talk about, well, why do we need this story? Who cares? Why does this story have to be told? That you have to think about the audience, that you have to think about the fundraising strategy. So I like that it kind of humbles you and makes you be a bit objective about your intentions and your approach, and steps back to think about the ecology or the world of this film, and then what is the market for it? Because ultimately you are creating a product, this film, and where is it going to go? So it's partly why we and other public media partners have invested a lot in digital, because we want younger audiences and they're watching everything online. So we're sort of going to them. And I hope that then they'll realize that there's Frontlines and Independent Lenses and Novas that they'll be interested in, but they're probably going to start by watching it on YouTube or streaming it. So I do think it's doing the homework and really thinking about what your story is, what's the dialogue you're trying to have, why do we need it? And why are you, and I guess the other thing I would say, why are you the person to tell it?
Jonathan, where would you start?
Wow. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. There's not much more to say. I think something that I can add to this is, if you are just getting started, find someone who can mentor you. That would be a really great thing to have. When I first started, we reached my filmmaking partner and I, we were equally green, reached out to some folks in the industry who were just incredibly generous with their time and their expertise and their advice and their input to help us do some of the things that Monica and Maury were talking about and do them well. And I also just want to say my first film was funded by ITVS, and they really took a risk on us and believed in us. And, that was, and I think ITVS is a place where you can go, even though it's like, what is it, Monica, like 700 submissions for 10 funds or funding films. But even though it's incredibly competitive, it's not that high, but it's incredibly competitive. But yet, if you do your homework and have a good story to tell, ITVS may be one of the folks that will back you when no one else will. And I'm eternally grateful to ITVS for really launching my career. So yeah, get help, and that part of that community is the community of people who are working with you to realize your vision, who are on the ground with you.
Tony Bell, anything?
Well, the first question I would ask is, as a filmmaker, do they think their project is a fit for PBS? And obviously, PBS is obviously well known, and they're the core place where documentaries are shown. But there are tons of other venues. I mean, HBO has a huge slate of documentary films. There are also opportunities for streaming now, Netflix as well, Amazon. So I would say the person should know their film and really know where it will fit. And to piggyback off of what Jonathan says is, if anyone is interested in having their film appear on a particular network or be part of a particular show, they should really get an advisor or someone on their team who has some affiliation with that. That way they can tap into that knowledge, but also it gives their film more credibility. Because there is a lot of, I would say, nepotism in the field. Yeah, a lot of people you see the same people getting the grants for the same producers. So if you could tap into that people should definitely take advantage of that.
I think you brought up actually a point, one of the biggest points of all, and that is to know what is on each network. I mean, I'm amazed when people come to me and say, hey, I have an idea to do such and such a program. And I say, what network is going to want this? What is this for? Because Discovery, A&E used to stand for arts and entertainment, and, Dog the Bounty Hunter is not arts and entertainment. And so, and I think the same thing applies to PBS if you want to do a PBS thing. So let me just
the same thing applies to festivals as well, because I have a lot of new filmmakers in their application. They say we want to go to Sundance.
Of course,
everybody wants to go to Sundance, but the film is not necessarily a fit for Sundance. So you have to do research in that arena as well.
I want to wrap this up by saying thank you for taking the time, all of you, to be at your computers and participate in Westdoc Online. It's been a pleasure. And I want to thank our sponsors too, Pond 5 and LumaForge. If you have a need, you should go to pond5.com or lumaforge.com, and both of them are great. The next show is going to be 2 weeks from today. It's on Wednesday. And thank you very much to our participants today. This has been Westdoc Online. Goodbye.